I'd like to welcome you all. Oh, here's another one coming in to this very first Spinifex Zoom launch. And it's the first time I have anchored a launch, so please forgive me if I make mistakes. I've been practicing. The launch will be recorded, so if you don't want to have any of yourself on it, please take your video off. And I have begun recording already. So first of all, I would like to acknowledge the country on which we are all based. Janet is speaking to you this evening from Gundungurra land in the Blue Mountains. Petra is from the Dja Dja Wurrung land of the Kulin Nation, and I'm in far north Queensland on the land of the Jiru people. So welcome to you all. I hope you'll all enjoy this. Just one housekeeping thing, which is to be on mute while the talks are going. If you want to ask a question, you can do so on the chat bit at the side, and then I'll be able to see it, I hope. We can all see it. Make it to everyone unless it's a private message. You can also do claps and thumbs up on the reactions button down the bottom. So the order that we're going to do is Petra to launch, Janet to respond. We'll gather any questions at that point if the system is still working. You know, we can't go for hours and hours. And then Renata will do some thank yous at the end. So I'm just going to introduce Petra. Dr Petra Bueskens is an Honorary Fellow in the School of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Melbourne. She's a psychotherapist in private practice and a freelance opinion writer. Her books include Modern Motherhood and Women's Dual Identities, and the edited volumes Mothering and Psychoanalysis and Australian Mothering, Historical and Sociological Perspectives. So over to you, Petra, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Susan. This is wonderful, and thanks for asking me. Okay, I've adopted my normal format rather than anything specific for digital, so I'm going to present a kind of formal paper in celebration of Janet's book. So, without further ado, in 1944, Arthur Koestler wrote an extraordinary essay called The Nightmare That Is a Reality, declaring the atrocity of the Holocaust when it was still not widely accepted as fact, and indeed when many were still denying it. The essay starts with a dream, or rather a nightmare, in which he is being murdered. He calls out to many bystanders, but none of them hear him. Oblivious to his suffering, they walk on, chatting and laughing. Musing on the archetypal significance of the dream, Koestler identifies a category of person he calls, quote, the screamers, an inelegant, if apt term for those who are the prophets, whistleblowers and pariahs in any age, lost and unheard in the thicket. While this is a well-known archetype, where Koestler gets interesting is in his identification of what we might call practiced unseeing. We have to know and navigate the implicit rules and norms of a society in order to be on the right side of them. It is the rebels, outsiders and deviants who reveal the law, not those snugly inside its lines. But, and this is his point, the insiders are not simply ignorant, nor in proverbial bliss. Rather, they are ever vigilant, always on the lookout for slippage in both self and other. Many, especially those in institutions that wield power, like hospitals, universities and law courts, are keenly aware of where the ideological lines lie. It is the practiced unknowing which afflicts the screamers and in turn society the most. I see Janet as a screamer in Koestler's archetypal sense of a seer, a whistleblower, a teacher and a pariah. As we come together tonight to celebrate her beautiful book, Born Still, and I've assembled it behind me so we can see it here, strategically placed. Let us take a moment to acknowledge Janet's extraordinary bravery to call out the abuses in routine medicalised childbirth practices, in her writing, in her political action, in her creation of the support group Joyous Birth, and in the mobilisation of her own story here. Let us celebrate Janet's insistence on women's rights in childbirth in the face of overwhelming opposition. And let us celebrate her integrity in helping so many women come to an understanding of normal birth, breastfeeding and attachment. Finally, let us celebrate Janet being able to tell this story, the story of giving birth at home to a stillborn baby and then being blamed for it, plastered all over the mainstream media in the most vulgar and sensationalist terms, character assassinating terms. Let us celebrate Janet finally being able to tell this story in her own words. And I've got my glass ready for later, but this seems a moment to almost be there. It is no surprise that Janet's book has been published by the wonderful Spinifex Press, which remains one of the few, if not only, spaces for radical feminists to publish their work. Let us celebrate Spinifex Press, run by the inimitable team of Susan Hawthorne and Renata Klein, for their commitment to fearless feminist and ecological writing. Born Still is a very special kind of memoir. It is, as Janet informs us in the opening pages, a political memoir in which the personal, specifically Janet's life, has been rendered so political by virtue of its disruptive place in institutional systems of power and governance as to have implications for the law and social practice, in particular in relation to home birth and independent midwifery. What is at stake, as Janet consistently reminds us, is the very female autonomy, both legal and cultural, on which they both rely, that is, on which home birth and independent midwifery rely. The book, it seems to me, speaks at three levels. First, at the level of the personal, the embodied, experiential, emotional story of a life lived and of a baby, little precious Roisin, birthed and lost in the same moment. Second, the book speaks at the level of the political, or the points at which Janet's exercise of autonomy conflicted with implicit and explicit norms regarding where, how and with whom to birth, which were also brought to bear in an analysis of Roisin's death. Finally, the book speaks at the level of the poetic. Here, Janet's unique capacity to fold her pain into art frames the text. These three, the personal, the political and the poetic, fold together to create a text that is at once lyrical, fierce, enlightening, and in the very best tradition of women's liberation writing. Maria Tamarkin recently said she loves non-fiction books by poets, and I have to agree. As she says, quote, "Poets think faster, make connections faster. I feel like there are so many swollen, bloated bits of non-fiction out there. Books that should have been essays, essays that should have been 2 paragraphs. But for poets, each word counts in a way that perhaps it doesn't for other writers." Janet's literary aesthetic in Born Still captures this sharp economical style. Experience is at once exquisitely rendered with not a word too many. As someone inclined to verbosity, I'm in awe of Janet's felicity. I've seen it on social media for years, where her quick wit and poetic sensibility combine to create sharp, insightful missives within seconds. Where I'm still musing and in a stare, Janet has summed up the problem and defined the debate. I can see you laughing, even though I can't hear. But her poetry is more than her capacity for verbal dexterity. It is also, as all good poetry is, a visceral quickening, an alchemy that stirs together the living and the dead. Poetry is liminal and takes us to the spaces in between. I see the poems in this book as the moments when Janet moves into the sublime, when she sits in the little crevice where for a cosmic moment she met Roisin, out there in the field, as Rumi might say, beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing. Her poetry emerges from this liminal space and punctuates the book. It breathes her and us into and through the birth chapter, staccato sentences ushered in and taken out with a poem. It opens the doors to chapters 3 and 5 and closes the doors of chapters 4 and 6. It concludes the book. I think of these poems as little breadcrumbs of her soul that guide us through the forest of this story, perhaps to the maligned and misunderstood witch's house and back again. They are souvenirs from this painful journey. Poetry lets Janet tell us in the language of the sublime what cannot be said in the language of the real. It helps us to understand the unfathomable accusations of lying, the deep pain of betrayal by people who should have behaved better, the grief of losing her baby, the extraordinary institutional abuse, and they usher us along Janet's journey through this hell. I'd like to pause on these words because they are central to the story. Lying, betrayal, institutional abuse, grief. In her powerful memoir, Janet holds together, both biographically and politically, the fragile nexus of birthrights, feminism, and our culture's fear and denial around both women's procreative capacity and death. Part of this fight, as Janet has understood from the beginning, is the invisible tripwire that says, sure, you can birth anywhere by law, but really hospital is the only safe space, and therefore any birth that doesn't happen in a hospital is suspect. And should anything go wrong, this is always already the fault of the mother and or her midwife. And yet, as research by Professor Marjorie Tew shows, and on which Janet draws, the transition from home to hospital birth saw a decline in women's safety. The key transition in women's health in childbirth, as elsewhere, is hygiene and nutrition. Indeed, in Safer Childbirth, A Critical History of Maternity Care, Tew shows that when men went to war, including especially the doctors, women's birth outcomes improved. And I learnt this from Janet's book. Since the medicalisation of birth, labouring women have been forced into the supine position, strapped to beds and forced to endure unnecessary and unwanted medical interventions, including intravenous syntocinon, premature rupture of membranes, caesarean sections, internal vaginal examinations, as Janet suffered expressly against her will during her first labour, forceps deliveries, episiotomies and more. In the 1960s and 70s, these procedures were sometimes performed in the presence of large groups of student doctors without the mother's consent, as women in my family have told me. I'm not suggesting these interventions are never necessary. Clearly, in rare instances they are, but they are not necessary at the rates we currently have them and are doing much more harm than good. Moreover, and one would think that in the year 2020 this would go without saying, but unfortunately it doesn't. A woman's permission is always the legal and ethical basis of any intervention on her body, including those deemed medically necessary. It turns out a lot is hinging on this. Interrupting normal vaginal birth, breastfeeding and attachment has serious consequences for our collective physical and psychological health. What we are learning in the paradigm shifting work on the human microbiome is that this complex system is handed from mother to child through birth, specifically vaginal birth and breastfeeding, in a process that is so important to our long-term health and immunity that it literally has implications for how resilient we are as biological organisms in the face of, say, a worldwide pandemic. It seems we have forgotten we are animals, intimately interwoven into local ecosystems and the earth at large. Research on the human microbiome is only around a decade old, but what we know is that the infant gets his or her first seeding through vaginal birth and breastfeeding, and that this sets up the immune system for life. In the same way that development research shows us that giving aid to women is the best way to ensure nourished and educated children, families and communities, giving birth back to women has massive implications for our collective physical and mental health. It is no exaggeration to say that natural birth is at the bedrock of human health at scale. Unfortunately, we have in the contemporary West an allopathic medical system that exceeds its place for reasons of money, power, fear, and control. As a consequence, we have a system of normalised obstetric violence that is increasingly being documented by women with research and writing skills who have themselves suffered. Women like psychology professor Kalina Christoph, who has painstakingly documented her experience. Evelyn Yang, wife of former US presidential candidate Andrew Yang, who was the subject of a recent long-form article on obstetric violence in the Washington Post, or our own Janet Fraser in this important book, Born Still, we are celebrating tonight. One wonders if women of this calibre, education and expertise are experiencing obstetric violence, how many more are suffering alone and in silence? Lest we think Janet is alone in being persecuted for exercising her choice in childbirth, she is not. She is one of several historical figures and a key Australian feminist in the fight for women's right to choose where, how and with whom they will birth. This fight is global and well documented by historians and sociologists, including our own Professor Kerrien Reiger, who refers to the birth rights movement as, quote, the forgotten women's movement, and showcased in the award-winning film Freedom for Birth, while also being fought in courts internationally by both midwives and mothers. It is worth mentioning at this point that independent Melbourne midwife Gay Emanuel and her assistant midwife Melody Bourne are facing charges of manslaughter as we speak. This is why women's autonomy sits at the bedrock of the home birth movement. While natural birth and the myriad positive outcomes that flow from it are hugely important, these are secondary to women's autonomy because from this first principle, all else flows. Janet asks us, through the poignant story of her own baby's death and her loss as a mother, followed by the nightmare of being blamed and quite literally the subject of an inquest, to reconsider and come to terms with the full meaning of women's autonomy in birth. It isn't simply the choice model of neoliberalism, the consumer model, which obliterates or renders impossible any choice that exceeds the limited ones that prioritise medical control. She asks us to move outside and beyond the Overton window stipulating birth in a public or private hospital with this or that bona fide medical attendant and shift to a model where women's choices and needs are at the centre. Janet's unflinching message is that birth is about women's autonomy and her attendants need to rally around her autonomy and support the mother rather than impose, cajole, insist, undermine or worse, abuse her. Janet is unfailing in her commitment to women's rights in childbirth and held to this line with deep integrity, even in the face of extreme vilification in the mainstream media and an inquest in which she was painted, in her words, as, quote, the worst mother since Lindy Chamberlain, which for our international listeners was the last very public, very bad mother in Australia falsely accused of killing her baby. In Born Still, Janet tells her story for the first time in her own words. And here we come into the fullness and complexity of her experience, the terrible grief of losing a wanted and cherished baby, and the unfathomable hell of then being blamed and vilified for it. In writing that is both exquisite and economical, poetic and political, feminist and fearless, she tells her own story as it happened. Always, she reminds us that childbirth is a key site of the feminist struggle for women's human rights. As the Hungarian midwife Agnes Goreb has argued, herself recently pardoned from a 2-year prison sentence, quote, the freedom in a country can be measured by the freedom of birth. This is the message that Janet's writing and life attest to, as laid out in this beautifully written political memoir. I raise a toast to Janet in celebration of her book, and I ask you all to do the same. And this is my kind of champagne. It's Dales for Dale. Congratulations, Janet, on this beautiful book.
Congratulations, Janet.
Congratulations, Janet.
Congratulations.
Congratulations.
Congratulations, Janet. You rock.
Okay. Well, over to you, Janet, to respond to what Petra has said and say whatever it is you have to say. Talk about your book, yourself, etc. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you all, Neil. I'm just working out how loudly I ought to be shouting.
That's fine.
Fine?
Yeah.
Gosh, Petra. You're one of my astoundingly intellectual comadres in this struggle, and I'm so touched and moved and grateful for what you said. I knew that you would find, as you can do, meaning in the work that I do. Please
I did, Janet.
Whoever you are.
One small thing, if you have your microphone on,
Yes.
we can hear somebody in the background.
Yes,
Please,
yes, it's very disturbing.
please mute yourself. Thank you.
Silent. Right. So it feels a bit like going second in a debating team now. So we're on the same side. Hi, Rose.
Hi, Janet.
Rose is my original feminist mentor, so I'm thrilled to bits to have her present.
Oh, thank you, Janet.
It is hard to know where to begin on an occasion like this. And how many occasions like this will I ever have from which to make a plan? I'm hoping there won't be a lot like the ones in the book from now on. But unlike the events I described there, I now have a group of readers who have some insight into the personal experiences and, I'm hoping, a wish to more deeply consider the political ones. Feminism has always been a search for liberation, deeply entwined with the sharing of stories. Perhaps this is a fireside relic, a throwback to attending the births and deaths in our families and communities, a yearning for the shared work that is harvest and churning. I know every woman here who has been in community and communion with other women knows the magic of that space. In telling the story of my life these last 10 years, I'm hoping to link each of us with our own capacity to tell those stories. Women's lives already hold the seeds of our liberation, but we have seldom managed to grow a protective forest from the seedlings. They're usually mown down by some force or other, over which we have no control. So we move on and plant more seedlings. I want each of us to tend a forest, grow a canopy of shade and green, plunge our toes into leaf litter and humus with that rich, pungent fragrance of experience and thought. What drifts down from that canopy, down onto the ground in which we plant ourselves? And in the way of these things, these stories are 100% about us and 100% about the forces which shape the stories, the forces without which the stories would look so very different. If I'd had my baby at home, born still 100 years ago, when the ways we controlled women were different, it would have been a personal, familial, communal sadness. As it was, the juggernaut of law and obstetrics meant to steamroll me in the most vicious ways via the death of my child. While I know there is understandable curiosity about this personal experience, for me it's a way to illustrate wider, important conversations we need to have. Home birth, as we knew it, is gone. Between coronial workings and now, as many of us predicted, criminal proceedings, women have lost not just the capacity for women-led birth with midwives of our choosing in our homes, but women have lost the model for it. Without a model, like wild trees made bonsai, we accept the curtailment of our root systems, which only go as deep as those pretty but shallow pots. We accept the constant dip pruning on the grounds that it's necessary for health. We continue to allow self-appointed authorities, which actually have no basis in law, to determine how our pregnancies and births progress. I want women to see a before time and know that they own birth, they own their birthing, and thus no regulations or rules apply. I have long said hospitals can make all the rules they like, but I am not a hospital, and I will not be governed by rules made by strangers about my own body. We give away too much when we dignify these controlling groups by asking their permission. No permission is needed to employ your inviolable body as you see fit. Writing this book was not fun. Writing this book was moderately satisfying in the way of a completed cycle. Of course, now we begin a new cycle as the book goes out into the world for critique and discussion. Writers should know that once you put that work out there, it's about the readers and their response. We are not our work. Though we provided a conduit, or in my case, an entire ecosystem of self via the conduit, to go onto pages for consumption by others, who will rightly make of it what they will. So write the damn book, if that's what you're wondering while you sit here. It won't be fun, but it might be the right thing to do. This is tricky. The danger with thank you lists is leaving someone off. I have practically agonised over how and whom to thank anyone, and sadly I don't remember the ball boys' names. I don't do higher powers, so I can leave deities off my list. But Spinifex Press comes pretty close to the divine in the importance she has to publishing in Australia, around the world, and in the vital documenting of feminism she provides. Susan and Renata took a bit of a gamble on someone they didn't really know all that well when they came to a conference paper and then asked if I'd be able to make it into a book. Writers dream of such happenings, right? So they stepped into this project and have been, as usual, brave and clear-sighted about bringing another story from the margins into the middle of the page. So that's it. And Pauline, who endured my incapacity to answer emails and calls and read the book over and over as well, that's a thank you. Rachel and Marilyn have recently come to my notice, but a big thanks to their work, because without them you wouldn't know about the launch and you wouldn't hold a little blue book right now. The thanks to sister friends are harder. There is no hierarchy in this circle of thanks, so I decided to make it alphabetical, which seemed appropriate for a book. Dom, who was there on the night, who is the friend to whose house the police took my children. You helped polish a lot of sentences, which were quite good. Now make some art. Michelle, you're along for the ride, and you read and you feel things I can't do. I could do life without you, but I really wouldn't want to. Petra, it's hard to fully address such a generous and thoughtful response to my work. You've always believed in the work, and we are alarmingly similar. In the tangle of politically personal life issues, I am delighted you're here. My local sister friend Rachel, who's here with food tonight, like actually here, thank you for hearing my many complaints while I was writing and for being here. And Erin, with whom I share some hard things and some beautiful things, thank you for your rage and your presence and also being here tonight. Skipping alphabetical, out of alphabetical for categories of their own, thanks to Peter O'Brien and Philip Strickland, whose many kindnesses are deeply appreciated. If a legal team can make the horrific slightly more manageable, you did, and I will never forget it. Thank you to the joyous birth women who brighten my life every day. Watching your children whose mothers are committed to making the world a better place for them, who fight every day, are the women who take food and make blankets when women struggle. It is just beautiful. The contagious courage radiating from each of you could not be more splendid. The Zoom Brady Bunch is chockers with you women tonight. Thank you to Mon for memes and the Perth gathering, which is occurring right now. And the answer to can cake be posted interstate? The answer is yes, if you're wondering. I didn't really have expectations about what might happen when the book was released. A lot of being ignored was my best guess, and there are people by whom I'm glad to be ignored. Surprisingly, I did not expect to hear from women who have also had stillbirths. I often feel very separate from communities which have developed around loss, partly because as a very bad mother, I wasn't given all the bundles of stuff women get in hospitals when they lose a baby, and partly because my experience has been unusual and my critique of that more unusual still. So it is with a subtle joy at being included, at being like the good mothers who also lose their babies and then reach out to me in kindness, that I find a delicate filigree of belonging developing in me. Stillbirth is so common, and the ways in which we are expected to mark this visceral loss are so constrained. If the world would crack open from a woman telling her truth, imagine if women's grief could be held in its truth, not shied away from, not platituded into palatable, bite-sized TV dinner experiences. What rich work could we all do if death was an opportunity for love, for growth, for increase and understanding? Life is shit, but manure is good. Turning the shit into the manure is the real work of the emotional alchemy we all need to pursue. I wish I could honour all the mothers who have shared gutting stories of mistreatment and stolen babies with me. Your babies appear on the dedication of my book, where my own children appear, all of them. Please don't stop telling me your stories or telling them in your circles. You do mother your babies, even if you were denied their faces for your memories of them. No one held those babies in their belly but you, and so no one can steal that knowledge from you, ever. I honour your pain and your survival with every word I write. Thank you for being here everyone. Thank you for reading this book, which, like the author, is small but cross and full of ideas. I deeply appreciate your time tonight, and I'm looking forward to questions. Thanks.
So, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Janet.
If you have questions, actually what would be easiest is if you just wrote them out first on the chat if you can, or you could put your hand up and do it this way, but I can't see everybody at the same time, so it's a bit hard to do it that way.
I see the questions, so as a question pops up, I'll ask.
Where and when to buy the book? Okay, you can buy
it from Spinifex.
Yes, you can buy it from the Spinifex Press website. That's assuming that you are in Australia. If you are overseas, as some of you will be, in America you can buy it directly from ipgbook.com, and the UK you can buy it directly from Gazelle Book Services. Just put those names into the search and they'll come up. So over the next 3 books in Blackheath has signed copies of Janet's book, so you can get a signed copy there if you are in the area, and if that's the case they will also deliver it to you free of charge. So that's probably the best answer for that. So the Spinifex website is the main place in Australia or New Zealand. Yes, do please ask your local libraries to get a copy. Thank you from Calvin for that. Sarah. Sarah, do you want to ask your question, since it's probably easier? If any of the...
Sure, I can do that. So Janet, I was just wondering, since it all started and since the launch of the, well, not since the launch of the book, but I'm just wondering if any of those public figures and journalists who were really dehumanizing of you have at any point acknowledged that or reached out and recognized your humanity at any point since then?
No.
Right, not surprising.
That's pretty terrible.
Occasionally, I hear from a woman, not a public figure. Occasionally, women send me a message or an email saying, I'm sorry, when your baby was born, I joined in the angry chorus, but in the years since then, I've seen how you were treated, and I realised that this was not really what I thought it was about at all.
Mm-hmm. I've been thinking about, since you wrote the book, I've been thinking about, I wonder if Mia Friedman would want to chat to you on her podcast, since it's, you know, such an important book about mothering and loss. And yeah, that's what prompted that question.
She reanimates me from beyond the grave.
Yes, so yeah, send Mia Friedman a copy. Well, we'll discuss that, whether that's a good idea or not. And somebody else suggests donating copies to the coroner's courts in every state. And Rachel says Mia got a media release. So any...
Check is in the mail.
Kirsty, how do you see us women getting birth back? What can we do now? Thanks, Kirsty.
Well, this is a complex question and a simple question. The simple answer is just do it. Stop waiting for people to give us permission. Stop dignifying authority figures who should have no say. I think this has always been one of the problems for the women's movement. Those of us who have a critique and would like to raise consciousness among our sisters aren't always able to be heard by those sisters. And I think over the millennia, there has been a deliberate policy of undermining the capacity of women to speak to one another about their own experiences and the experiences of other women. You know, we have no forum in which women can tell their birth stories or be honoured in the telling of those birth stories. So instead, many women use the opportunity of hearing that another woman is pregnant to start to debrief their experience. And then we call it a horror story. Yes, all right, we do have an internet forum, Susie's right. And, you know, this is the purpose of Joyous Birth. It's a giant consciousness raising exercise. I think the other thing that I have always said is that birth is simply a reflection of women's lives. And when women's lives are better, women's birthing is better. So encouraging everyone around us to believe in her own humanity, who sees her power, stop asking permission. Also, if women become obstetricians and lawyers instead of doulas and midwives, that would help, as they're the power brokers. And the real victories of activism nowadays, like fracking and so forth, they're won in the courts. And that tells me something really important about how society is functioning. Thanks for the question and the flowers, Christy.
There's another question here about the if it's appropriate. Can whoever, it's just gone off my page. Can whoever put that? Actually,
thanks, Karen. I don't think it's appropriate for me to comment because it is sub judice. However, I always stand in solidarity with women before courts. And I hope that other women look for ways to support their sisters.
Okay. I am a little worried that everything will just drop out on me because we're on to the last 5 minutes or so. So what I'm going to propose is that Renata does the last thank yous, and then after that we can just leave the mics on and talk amongst ourselves. So Renata.
Okay, I will do that with pleasure. So firstly, hello and goodbye everybody. And the thank yous. Well, my very biggest thank, of course, goes to Janet. I mean, it's fair to say that when Pauline, Susan and I edited the book, we were actually in tears. And sometimes Pauline and I would say, oh, can we even write to Janet again? Because something is not right in the order, but can we do it? Because it was palpable that Janet really was distressed by having to remember everything and putting it on the page. I think Janet has done admirably well, and the book is wonderful to read and is really testament, as Petra and Janet have said, to this incredibly important business that is women's business, that is giving birth to children. So thank you, Janet, from my heart. And yes, it is true, we don't usually do that we go to a conference, hear a conference paper and then rush to the speaker and say, this has to be a book. But it happened last year in Sydney at the Amrichi conference, and we were just so taken aback by Janet's moving presentation that we really thought this injustice has to be brought out to the open again. And we really hope that it will go far and wide, and so far it has already gone quite wide. So keep buying the book. And as Susan said before, it is available wherever you are in the world. And if you go on the Spinifex website, you will see on the first page, it has order, it says order. And if you click on that, you get all the details in case you didn't write them down. Then secondly, my big thanks go to Petra, who did a very wonderful launch. And I'm sorry we couldn't really toast together. We will next time when we see one another. So thank you, Petra. And then it's the team Spinifex that is a fantastic team. And I don't know, I can't see Pauline, but she should be here.
Here.
Pauline, our senior editor, who is just...
I am here. I am here, Renata.
Oh, hello, Pauline. Yes, yes. Pauline is a very fantastic woman editor. A pleasure to work with. Sometimes we have very late night conversations, and without her contribution, the book wouldn't be nearly as good. So thank you very much, Pauline. Then thank you also to Rachel, who is the promotions person. And yes, Janet, you will get to see more of her. To Marilyn, who I don't also have on my screen. She's our office manager, who has been with us for 20 years. And if the day comes when she says, I don't want to do it anymore, we can't do it either, because she knows everything and we don't. Then Caitlin, who has a very beautiful photo in the middle of the screen. And she's our social media person and has to deal with Twitter and whatever, Facebook, etc. So thank you very much, Caitlin, for doing such a fantastic job.
Thank you.
And that's really the team. That's really a Spinifex team. And of course, Susan and I. And Susan also did quite a bit of editing on Janet's book. And we did cry together sometimes because we got so enraged again on your behalf. So I think that's a good thing if your publishers cry with you. So I'm just very honored to doing this book. Maybe I could also say that our next book is going to be by Sheila Jeffries, that many of you know. Now it hasn't got anything on childbirth on it, but it's got a lot of stuff on radical feminism. You're laughing, Sarah. On radical feminism. So please, if you want to get angry, read that. And then the next book in October is by Heather Brunskill-Evans, and that will get us even more into hot water because it's on the unfortunate transgender story. It's called Transgender Body Politic. And if you read it, you will never think that transing is a good thing. Never, ever again. So I can already pre-publicize that. And then later in November, our very Susan Hawthorne has her, I don't want to say seminal, so it has to be ovular book, Vortex, of Patriarchy, which we're still working on, and that too is a very good read and will make you think. So I think that's all. You have mentioned Glee books already, if you are living in the Blue Mountains and they have signed copies, but other than that, just ask your bookshop to get it in and you'll agree. But if you're in Australia, you of course can buy it from our website, very easy with a click. And it is an ebook as well. So nothing stops you from recommending it to your friends. I think that's all I want to say. Anybody else has got to say anything? And now I've got the welcome to country slide again. We should probably be the goodbye to country slide.
If I could say one thing, it was just on the question of what women can do to, change things for women giving birth. I just wanted to mention that supporting Indigenous rights, especially women, is important in that because they also have their struggle. They used to be able to, their culture is to, give birth at birthing trees and different things. And they've obviously been banned and it's been made illegal to do that. So I just wanted to mention that they have a same but separate fight in the same way that Janet is inspiring us to fight for change, to support the Indigenous women we know when they're giving birth, if they want to do it based on their culture. That was it.
Last year we published a book called Karu, Growing Up Gurindji, which is in both Gurindji language and in English, and it's about child rearing practices among the Gurindji people. And one of the reasons they wanted to do this book is because they are not taken seriously in the hospitals. And so this book is a way of doing that. So we're trying to be in there.
Post-birth has always had links with the Birthing on Country movement. I actually spent my afternoon trying to find advocates for a particular Aboriginal woman. So, yeah.
Yeah, awesome.
And please do subscribe to our newsletter and follow us on social media. So that's just where you can see that. So, any more discussion? Okay, I'm going to stop the share then, go back to the faces. Anybody else want to say anything at the moment? We're up to 51 minutes and I don't know if it keeps going for how much longer, so I'm just trying to be careful. Please put social media links in chat too. Or you just go to the Spinifex Press website, brand new website, beautiful, and you get all of the connections there. Okay, I hope that helps.
Maybe a final toast to Janet.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Congratulations, Janet.
Congratulations,
Janet.
Congratulations, Janet.
Congratulations, Janet.
And thank you.
Thank you for all your hard work.
Real dream in real life.
Make some noise. Thank you.